Yesterday, January 29, 2026, Burkina Faso's government took a step that's going to draw a lot of attention internationally. The Council of Ministers, under the country's military leader, Captain Ibrahim, formally approved a decree that dissolves all political parties. Every single one, all political formations in the country, gone. At least in terms of their legal standing. Now, this is a major shift. We're talking about the complete dismantling of the multi-party system. And the government stated reason, they say it's about reducing division and strengthening national unity. That's the official line. So let's break this down. Let's break down what this actually means and how they are framing it. So what exactly has happened here? The government has issued an official decree that immediately dissolves all political parties. Effective now, the legal framework that allowed these parties to exist and operate, that has been removed. So as of this moment, political parties in Burkina Faso no longer have any official standing. And there is more. All assets held by these dissolved parties, we're talking property, funds, whatever they had, all of that is being transferred to the state. Now, the government has said that new rules, new legislative frameworks for how political parties might be established in the future, those will come later, but only after they've completed what they are calling a comprehensive national development framework. So essentially, they are saying, first, we build the national plan, then we figure out what role, if any, political parties will play along going forward. Okay, so let's get into the government's reasoning here, because they've laid out a fairly detailed argument. Their core position, and this is really the heart of it, is that multi-party democracy, by its very nature, creates fragmentation. That competitive party policies inherently divide society and weakens national cohesion. The argument is that when you have parties competing against each other, you get divisions that undermine the country's ability to move together towards shared goals. And look, this argument isn't entirely new. Other countries have, at various points in history, restructured their governance to prioritize unified national direction over party competition. So, there is a historical precedent for this kind of thinking. The government's position seemed to be when a nation's survival and development are on the line, having fragmented institutions poses a real risk to the state's ability to function and to social stability. There's another layer to this. The government is also making an argument about incentives, or rather about how the incentives structures in a multi-party system work. Now here's the logic. In a multi-party system, opposition parties, regardless of whether the government is doing something good or bad, they have a built-in incentive to obstruct, to delay, to undermine. And this happens even when the policies being proposed would actually benefit the country. Why, you may ask? Because opposition parties gain by making the ruling party look like it's failing. So even if a policy is constructive, there's pressure to block it if it will make the government look good. The success of the nation in this framework becomes secondary to the political fortunes of competing parties. And then there is the issue of transitions. When a government comes in, they often dismantle or restructure whatever their predecessors were doing. Not necessarily because those initiatives were bad, but because they want to establish their own identity and prevent the previous administration from getting credit. So you end up with this constant stop and start, and the country never maintains a consistent long-term direction. So what's the alternative the government is proposing? Basically, a governance structure where there is a coherent national development framework that's protected from the partisan political cycles. Under this kind of system, when leadership changes, you wouldn't get wholesale policy reversals. The institutional design would ensure that regardless of who is in charge, regardless of individual leaders, the country maintains a consistent direction toward predetermined development goals. And here is an interesting part of how they've framed this up. They are suggesting that even if, for lack of a better word here, someone incompetent or someone with questionable integrity ends up in a leadership position, the institutional constraints and the predetermined frameworks would limit their ability to deviate from the established national priorities. So the system itself, in theory, provides the guide rails. The government has also referenced other countries, other governance models that have moved away from multi-party competition in pursuit of unified national development. They are pointing to cases where significant economic and social progress happened outside of a multi-party democratic framework, as long as there was institutional coherence and development planning in place. The implication here is pretty clear. Governance effectiveness, in their view, isn't necessarily determined by whether you have multi-party competition. It's about whether your institutions are actually aligned with your development objectives and national priorities. Now, the government knows what the response to this is going to be. They are anticipating that critics, particularly international observers, certain media outlets, are going to call this anti-democratic. They are going to say this is an attempt to centralize state power. The government's counter to that is, you're framing this wrong. They're saying the question isn't whether governance should be democratic. The question is what institutional mechanisms actually serve national development and unity best. They are also anticipating another line of criticism, that this reform doesn't genuinely serve national interests, that it primarily benefits whoever currently in power by eliminating opposition. Their response to that, they point out that this decision was made while opposition still existed. Their argument is, if this were purely about consolidating power, you wouldn't undertake these reforms while there is active resistance. You would wait until you have actually already neutralized opposition. All right, so here's a deeper philosophical argument the government is making here, and it's worth laying out. It concerns the principle of universal electoral participation, or I should say, the promise that elections produce good outcomes because voters make informed choices. The government's position suggests that electoral outcomes aren't primarily determined by voters' informed assessment of candidates' governing capacity or policy knowledge. Instead, They are arguing that votes are driven by things like partisan identification that people inherit from their families or communities, material incentives. We're talking about things like rice distributions, gifts, cash, handouts. Emotional decision making, or decisions that made under various influences. Hometown affiliations that have nothing to do with whether a candidate is actually competent. Tribal or communal identity rather than actual policy substance. Now, if these factors are what's really driving electoral outcomes, and that's a big if, because this is their argument, then the democratic principle that the majority should determine governance becomes problematic. Because you would have a system where the majority's decisions are driven by factors that have nothing to do with what's actually good for the country. The government also points to how multi-party parliaments often function, or rather, how they often don't function. Their observation is that members elected from different parties frequently operate as adversaries rather than collaborators. Parliament is supposed to be a deliberate body working on national development policy. But when it comes to a venue for inter-party competition instead, institutional effectiveness breaks down. So what's Burkina Faso's stated alternative? They want to replace party-based competition with a comprehensive national development framework. And according to what they've laid out, this framework would establish coherent long-term objectives, economic and social governance, protect development continuity even when leadership transitions happen, remove the political incentives that drive obstructionisms, align institutional structures with development goals rather than electoral goals, and create constraints that limit individual leaders' ability to deviate from national priorities. The government says this framework will be developed before any new political structures are formalized. The idea being that whatever future institutions look like, they will be designed to align with predetermined development trajectories. So here's where we are. Burkina Faso's government has made a deliberate institutional choice to prioritize national unity and development coherence over competitive party politics. Whether this actually produces what they are promising, which is enhanced unity, faster development, less institutional dysfunction, that remains to be seen. That's going to be determined by what actually happens on the ground. What this decision really reflects is a judgment call. The government has concluded that for Burkina Faso's specific circumstances, multi-party competition creates cost divisions, obstructions, policy discontinuity that outweigh the benefits you might get from competitive accountability and institutional pluralism. Now, different people are going to assess this trade-off differently. It depends on how you weigh governance effectiveness versus democratic competition. Institutional safeguards against power concentration versus development outcomes. Now, these reforms isn't inherently democratic, and it isn't inherently authoritarian either. It's a structural choice with genuine trade-offs, and the consequences are going to depend on how it's implemented and how the institutions are actually designed going forward. Well, we will be watching how this develops. This is Frontline Africa. If you value truth unfiltered and power reframed from an African lens, subscribe, like, share your thoughts. I am your host, P. Solomon, and I'll see you in the next episode.